Scale formulas, C major, A minor, and related modes. This time looking at the C major scale, otherwise known as the C Ionian mode, starting the scale from the C note located on the top heavy E string of the guitar, fret number 8, putting special focus on the step from the first of the scale to the second of the scale. One of our major objectives is to line up all of our resources in the same direction, making them as easy on the eyes as possible from the perspective of the player of the guitar who is located behind the guitar. Therefore, for example, my guitar is going to look like I'm playing left-handed, but I'm not. We just flipped the guitar around in order to mirror your perspective from behind your guitar as though you were playing your guitar into a mirror. Similarly, our Excel worksheet representing the fretboard is going to have this representing the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on the guitar, top to bottom, left to right, situated as though we just took our guitar and imprinted these strings on that screen, so that you can basically line up what we have on our mock fretboard in Excel on top of what I'm doing, which is going to mirror what you are doing, all of the directionality going the same way from your perspective as the player of the guitar. We now want to look at the guitar in terms of the formula and really kind of dig down on the formula and see how it relates to a guitar, which is a little bit different than you would see it in music theory, which is usually lined up first to a piano, which is kind of the easiest way to see it because it's lined up basically in one linear fashion, whereas the guitar, of course, has one string is kind of like the piano, but then we have all the strings that are on top of each other, which confuses the formula, which means that I think a lot of people don't view the guitar from the perspective of the formula. How do people often view the guitar? We learn the guitar usually by shapes, right? So we learn, I might not know exactly what I'm playing, but I know this is like a C shape, right? I'm like, okay, I know that works. I know this is an A minor, this is a G shape. So we kind of learn those shapes, and we typically learn them in open position first. Those shapes actually encompass only 3 notes because they're triad chords. We can convert those shapes into the scale by adding 2 more notes, and we can call that then a pentatonic scale, a 5-note scale. And if we add 2 more notes to get to the major scale, we would have our 7 note scale. Now note, so that means that you can learn using what we might call the caged system, an idea of breaking out these notes to kind of name those shapes and break the fretboard into basically 5 chunks that fit our fingers. Why do they fit our fingers? Because that's how the guitar was designed. So it makes sense to cut the guitar kind of into 5 chunks and be able to play all the shapes in the 5 chunks, possibly naming those around the shapes that we learn in open position, because that's just a natural way that we start learning things in open position first, and we can use that knowledge to move up the guitar. But the bottom line then is that, for example, this shape, which is right in the middle of the guitar, which if I'm just looking at the pentatonic shapes, meaning 5 notes out of 7, usually people think of it from the standpoint of an A, which means it would be playing a minor or Aeolian mode, would sound something like this, just the top bit of it. And then if I add the 2 other notes to get the 7 notes, we get that. So that shape is quite common to play kind of in the middle of the guitar. That's kind of like the rock and roll shape, but usually it's in a minor mode because we're playing from A to A. So that's one way we can learn the shape, is we just learn the patterns, and then we can go up and down the guitar and play the patterns. What are those patterns? We kind of think of it as basically, that's like if you go outside of these colored notes, you're stepping in the lava, and it's not going to sound good if you step in the lava. That's kind of how we start to think of it oftentimes, right? So I can play anything I want as long as I'm on these colored notes. That's not really good enough to really make things sound good, because I also have to kind of pinpoint where I am in the scale, so that I know if I'm playing in A minor, then I have to kind of make that my tonic. Here's my tonic. So I have to at least be able to say know when I'm going home, and that will give me a lot more ability to play something in it. But I can use any of these notes that are colored as the tonic, thinking of it at home as home, which will convert us from playing in that case an Aeolian to a C major if I focus on the C, or a D Dorian, and so on and so forth. So that's one way that we learn, that we kind of learn the guitar. We learn it in open position, just learning chords, and then we try to pivot up to the middle of the guitar, usually starting in the middle with this shape, often learning it in the key of A minor because you naturally start on an A, but it's also all the same notes as the C major, which makes sense to learn because learning in C major is kind of like a tradition that often happens because in part the piano is tuned in essence to a C major. So that makes sense. It doesn't have any sharps and flats in it. So that gives us kind of a check figure to see that if I'm playing a sharp or a flat, then I have something that's I could see that something is wrong there. So I have that as a check figure. And so that's why we often start in C major. But remember that this shape is totally movable. So if I move this entire shape up, if I pivot all the colored notes, just like on an Excel worksheet, to the right, then I can shift it to any basically major scale, and all of the related pattern will remain. That's the beauty of the guitar, even more so than is on the piano, because although the pattern shifts up on the piano, you have a difference in the intervals of the keys on the piano. The black keys are skinnier than the white keys. So that means that you actually have a different hand pattern when you're playing on the piano, because you have to adopt for the fact that the piano is basically all the white keys are in the key of C, as if you're playing in the key of C major, right? So if I move the same pattern up, then I have to adopt the black keys in the piano. Whereas on the guitar, we don't have all the frets are basically the same, so the pattern shifts up basically exactly, so the shapes all kind of shift up. So that's one way we can learn it. The other way we typically would want to learn it is the intervals. We have a whole other course or section on intervals, where basically those are great because now I can choose each of these notes in the shape, and I can build around that note using it kind of like you would with a compass. Like if I'm trying to, the circle is here and I put the point of the circle and then I draw around in a circle. Well, it's not a perfect circle here, obviously, but if I choose like the G note, then I'm using the fifth of the major scale, right? And I choose that G note, and then I can measure the intervals around that and build this same shape from here. I could do that with the C note, which means I'm going to take the C, which is the Ionian, and I'm going to look at all the intervals from the perspective of that note. Now that's a really useful way to do it, not because people often build the entire scale from that, although you can, and that's a useful exercise, but because it helps you to build chords. So instead of just seeing the chords as a shape, I just know the shape and I know the top note of the chord, perhaps. I'm going to build the chord by looking at a particular note, the root note, and build the intervals that I know are associated with the chord, the 1, 3, 5. So that's another way that you can kind of look at it. And then the third way, which I don't think is utilized as much, is what we're going to focus on here, the formula. And this is one of the first things you learn in music theory, but then you kind of drop it off a little bit on the guitar because you start to focus on the patterns and the intervals. So on the guitar, let's look at one string at a time, either the top string or the bottom string, and just think of the pattern in terms of the C major or Ionian mode. So if I was on this C and I'm going to the next note in the scale, then I'm going to put holes for a whole step. A whole step is going to be two notes up. So the unit of measure for music is a note up, a half step. And then so we have, if we can measure it in wholes and half steps. So a whole step just means 2 notes up. A half step means 1 note up. Now notice I'm measuring the distance between here. That becomes kind of a problem because when I put this whole step, I kind of want it to be in between these notes. This is the step to get there. But I'm going to put it on the C. So when I'm on this C, a whole means it's going to go 2 notes up from this point. So I go 2 notes up from the C to the D. I skip this note, which I'm going to call it can be named either C sharp or D flat. This would be just like on the piano. This note on a piano would be the black key, the one that you could skip if it was in C major. Then we're on the D, another whole step from the D to the, let's pull this over, to the E, and then there's a natural half step from the E to the F. So there's a natural half step, so that's going to be a small h that we're going to represent it as. So from going from here to here, it's going to be a half step, and then from the F, we're going to take a whole step to get to the G. From the G, we're going to take a whole step to get to the A, and from the A, we have a whole step to get to the B, and then from the B, we're going to go home, back, half step back to C. So going from here to here takes us all the way back home, noting that there's 12 notes in the musical alphabet, right? But then we go one more, basically going back home. So the formula that we typically learn then is going to be whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half to get back home. And remember that those are the in-between bits, right? That's the steps that you're taking from basically each note. Now, the reason that's kind of an issue on the guitar is because, of course, I'm not always playing on one string as we are with the piano, which just goes in one direction infinitely. Because what happens is then I go to the next string down here, and that throws off my entire pattern. And what people tend to do, instead of trying to adopt the pattern as they go down a string, they say, well, I'm just going to abandon the pattern, and I'm going to just learn the shapes and or the intervals, which works. That's a good way to do it, but it would be best to look at it from different perspectives. So that's one problem. Another problem is that I don't always want to play in a major key. I want to play in the minor key, and possibly in the Dorian, and so on and so forth. And people usually only learn the pattern from one perspective, from the major. And if you play with the pattern, but you only learn it in the major, that would be like you're playing the piano like only the white keys, which is totally cool. I used to, as a kid, you can play infinite amount of things, obviously in one scale, but it'd be nice if I can play, and it would be only in the white key and only going from C, right, as your tonic, though, which would be even more restrictive. But what we would like to do is be able to start the pattern from any area. And this is where I think a lot of people get, that we start to tell ourselves like we know the pattern one way, and we don't look at it from multiple basic perspectives, right? So we don't look at it from the Dorian, or if I start it from here, then I would be playing in the Phrygian, right? And so on and so forth. So I'd like to be able to learn the pattern kind of like I would learn the alphabet going from A to Z, but be able to start the alphabet from any point, right? And then count from there without having to sing the song up to that point. And then be able to know where I'm starting from and where the tonic is. We also have the issue of going backwards. So in other words, if I start on this C and I go backwards, a lot of times we don't really emphasize that going backwards. So that's what we're going to practice here, including me. I'm practicing on drilling this down as well. So if I go backwards, notice I'm not going to look at this W for a whole step back. I'm going to look at the destination. So if I'm going from this C, the half step is here. That's where I'm going, not the whole step, the half step. So if I go C back, it's going to be a half step, and then it goes a half step back to here. And then it goes a whole step to here, the destination, a whole step to here, the destination, a whole step to here, the destination, a half step to here, a whole step to here, and then a whole step back home. All right, so going backwards is usually a lot more difficult for people to say the formula in reverse, like it is difficult to say the alphabet in reverse. So that's what we'll kind of practice as well. And the other thing now I lost my train of thought here. So we'll basically learn that. Now the other thing is going backwards. Notice that we're using terms whole steps and half steps. So one of the kind of nice things about learning or thinking about this in a formula is I can play the scale. I can go up and down the scale, and if I know where I'm at on the scale, I know the next note in the scale is always going to be either a whole step or half step away. See, you see, there's if I look at this pattern here, there's never a time where I go where I skip 2 notes, right? I never skip 2 notes in the pattern. So if I'm playing anything that has all 7 notes in it, whether that be the Ionian mode or any of the other related modes, I can be sure that the next note in the scale that's safe to play without stepping in the lava is either going to be a half step or whole step away, right? And so that's useful to know, and it also means that if I'm kind of playing my scale here and I'm trying to walk up my scale but play it on multiple strings, then those distances in terms of intervals are always going to be either a 1 note away minor second or a 2 note away major second. So that's another way we name the intervals, and this is what gets a little bit wonky when we once again go from the formula terminology to like interval terminology. The intervals typically being used when we're measuring from a point, such as if I'm in the key of C, C is my tonic, I'm going to measure every other note as compared from the focal point of the tonic. Whereas in the formula, I'm going to walk up the formula. I'm going to go from the C to the D, and then I'm going to measure from the D to the E. So I want to use that formula to also kind of look at the perspective of what's the difference between whole steps and half steps when I'm looking at it that way versus the idea of intervals. And then as I go from the D to the E, notice basically what I'm doing there is I can think of myself in like the Dorian, right? Because then that would be like the D to the E on the Dorian. So we could start to try to reiterate in our mind different kind of starting points as we go through this formula. Now, when we go backwards through the formula, notice we don't usually have the interval going the other way. In other words, if I'm going back from the D to the C, it's a whole step this way. When I think about the formula, I'm taking a whole step back. But if I look at the interval between a D and a C, it always goes forwards, right? So in other words, if I'm looking at the D to the C, I only think of it basically going one way from an interval perspective. So in other words, if I'm going from the D back to the C, there's a distance between these 2 notes of a whole step, which is 2 notes, but the inverse of that, which is going to be 12 minus 2 or 10, would be the interval that we would use. It would be a 10 note away minor 7 if I'm going from a D to a C, which means that if I went up 10 notes, right, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, we would get to the C from the D. So the intervals are always, when I measure the intervals, I'm always going up, right? So when I measure an interval, I'm always going one direction. But when I look at the formula, I'm taking whole steps and half steps, which means I can take whole steps and half steps going forward through the formula, or whole steps and half steps going backwards through the formula. Okay, so those are a couple things that I want to keep in mind. Now, as we do this, I'm going to tell the formula on one string, and then I'm going to emphasize the one step on the formula. In this case, it's going to be the second, and try to find each of those steps on each of the strings so that we can resume the formula on each string. That'll be our general kind of practice here. So for example, and also remember that this formula down here applies only to the bottom and top strings. If I go to this A string and I look at that C, it's not going to tie out to this whole step, it's going to tie out to this whole step, right? The C, you have to shift the formula to where the C is if you look at any other string. All right, so that's the idea. So we've played out the formula on one string. So if it was on the same string and we played this out, it would be a whole step here and then a whole step to the E, and now this 12th fret repeats on fret 0 because there's only 12 frets on the guitar. So I could, in theory, go up the guitar depending on how many frets we have, but I'm going to try to bring it back to this step. So if I played this on the guitar, right, we're gonna say it's gonna be a whole step from 1 to 2 is a whole step, and then from 2 to 3 is a whole step, and then that E is also an open E up here. So now I'm back to this E. So then we have an E to F is a half step, F to G is a whole step, G to A is a whole step, A to B is a whole step, and then B back home to C is going to be our half step. So that's going to be the general idea on one string. Now let's compare it. Now let's always take this half step here, or this from the first to the second, and try to play it on each string. So it's going to be a major second away. If I play it down here, it's going to be here. So now I can play the same formula, but now I'm going to break it up on the second step to the next string. So how do I know it's going to be down here? Like if I was on the guitar, how could I skip down to this string if I'm going from the first to the second, and then I'm going to play the formula from here? Well, I know there's a distance between each string of 5 notes, except between the G and the B string. So there's a distance of 5 here, and then if I go back, it's 4, 3, 2, 2 notes away, which is a whole step. So we're taking a whole step from this C to that D. So now I can play this formula, and I could do that again on this string, but I'm going to emphasize that one step that we're gonna change. So let's see if I can put. So I've put the numbers down here so that we can see the steps in terms of the relative position. So we're looking at the C major scale. These are the relative positions of the C major scale, and we can also think of all of these positions as modes too. So as I go through this, I also kind of want to look at this in terms of modes, because if I can start to see these shapes and I can see them as the starting point of each of the modes, then I can shift my view so I can see each of these notes as they're related to the mode and start them from any place within the formula on that point, right? So how am I going to name the modes? Now it's Ionian, the second is a Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the Aeolian, Locrian. Those are hard names to get. If you just keep drilling them, you will get them, but they're obviously, if they're not your native tongue, they're going to be a little bit wonky to get at first. It's nice to give them a numbering system. Notice I'm giving them the same numbering system here as I have with the relative positions of the major scale. And that's a convention, because I'm just using that because the major scale is our main major scale in Western music. So if I name the modes as an absolute mode number on those major scales, then when I go down to like the Dorian mode, notice the relative positions change. The notes are going to be all the same, but we've just shifted our focal point starting on the second note of the formula, making it now the first note of the formula. But I'd like to still see all of my notes here from the perspective of an absolute position. So in other words, this Dorian, although this D is the Dorian, and it's this same D, it's in the same position on the guitar because we're still playing the same notes, right? It's just that now we call it the first of the Dorian, but I still want to call it absolute mode number 2. The 2 just simply being the relative position to the major scale, but it's also I can also call it the Dorian. Why? Because then I can give that note an absolute position, a modal position, so that so no matter what mode I'm in, I know that that's absolute position number 2, the Dorian. I can orient myself on the guitar, right? So that's the other thing I want to kind of keep in mind here. So other thing I want to kind of think about as I go through this, I'm sorry, I'm laying this out a little bit messy right now, but we'll get into a rhythm hopefully, and as we go forward through all these scales, and we'll just beat this basically to death, hopefully, is my plan, and we'll keep on going over it so that I can try to emphasize as many things from a theory standpoint in the shortest amount of time as possible in our practice sessions. So the other thing I'd like to be able to see is the different perspectives between each of the notes. So notice here I'm on the first of the major. notice in our shapes where the first lives. If I break out all these shapes to 2 and 1 string shapes, there's a what I call a double stop, and I'm calling this the house or box. I have the 1 string shape, which I'm calling the meat of the hamburger, because if it was a pentatonic, this would be like a hamburger like they do in computers. And then you have, this is also the square, but it's been shifted up because there's a tectonic plate, or I call it a fault line right here. There's a difference in the tuning. So I think of it as this being shifted up. So the square is still here. It just got split, right? So there's the square, and then here's another double stop, but it's just got split. So we have here a double stop square or house, and then a house double stop, right? So those are going to be the shapes that will keep on repeating. This bottom string is the same as the top string. So you can see this is the top of the double stop house shape. Now the reason that's useful is that I can now determine where each of the starting points of each of the modes live, which I can then apply the formula to from that point. So in other words, this C, the Ionian mode, the start of the Ionian mode, absolute mode number 1, will always be at the top of the house. Even if I'm in the Dorian mode, if it's a D Dorian related to the C major, it's always going to be at the top. The C is still at the top of the house. Even though I'm focused on the Dorian, the D, the C, I'm still going to call it the absolute mode number 1 or Ionian mode, and it will always be in the same shape. So I can say there's in that shape is going to be the C, and then the Dorian is always going to be like the double stop kind of moves. So it's at the bottom of the double stop. So that's going to be where the Dorian shape is when I'm looking at the double stop house shape. Okay, and then so I can look at this from the perspective of the C, of course, which means I'm going from the relative position 1 to relative position number 2. So that makes sense. And if I look at it from a modal standpoint, I'm going from what I would call absolute mode number 1, Ionian, to absolute mode number 2, then the Dorian. So if I played this shape up here, once again, I'd say this is going to be going from a whole step here, and then it's going to go from there. So it's going to go whole, and then half, right? And then whole, and that's going to get me to the end of this string. So then I'm going to bring, that is going to be over here, same note, and then whole, and then brings me back home to the half here. So let's see if I play it. So if I started here, instead of going up on the formula this way, I'm going to say there's the 1, and then whole step to the 2, whole step to the 3, and then half step to the 4, whole step to the 5, whole step to the 6. That's on the 12th fret, that A. So the 6 is open here. From the 6, whole step to the 7, and then half step to the 8, otherwise known back as a 1. There's another C. So here's the C. These are the same string from here to here. So boom, boom. Okay, so now let's do it. Let's go down 1 and say, okay, what if I go and to the next half step down. Let's go trying to get in the rhythm here on this. I know it's a little sloppy to start off here, but we're going to say, what if I went now to the D down here? Where's the D on this string? So I'm looking from this. I want to do my same formula, but I want to skip from the 1 to 2 strings down, right? So I'm going to go 2 strings down. Well, that means I'm going to the 2. I need to look at a 2 note away distance, which we can call a 2 note away major second. So I need a 2 note away distance. There's a 5 notes between each string. So on this string, there's a distance of 5. There's a distance of 10 to get here, 10, 11, 12. So now I'm back home to the tonic. So 12, there's only 12 notes in the musical alphabet, so I can start over again, 12 or 0, 1, 2. So if I want to go in my formula to this 2, it would be easiest to reach it up here, right? So I can say if I'm going to do my formula from here, and then I'm going to go up 2 strings. It's going to go 5, 10, and then 11, 12, octave, 1, 2. So it'd be 1 to 2. So instead of going 1 to 2, I'm going 1, 2 up here, and then that's the last note, or in the 12th octave or the 12th string. So I then could keep going this way to the right, or I could go down more, but I'm going to bring it back then as our practice because I'm just focusing on the second. So the D is there. So E, F, G, and then A, B, and that brings us back to C, which is this is the octave of where we started. So I'm going from the first up here, I'm going to the 2, so it's a whole step, 1 to whole step 2. I'm going to bring that same 2 back here, which is a D. Now open D, 2 to 3 is a whole step, 3 to 4 is a whole step, 4 to 5. I'm sorry, 3 to 4 is a half step, 4 to 5 is a whole step, and then 5 to 6 is a whole step, 6 to 7 is a whole step, 7 to 8 is a half step. Hopefully I got that right. And there's the octave. All right, so let's go to the next one down and try the next one, and then we'll keep on emphasizing this. Let's go down to the next one and say, okay, let's say we're going to do that, the half step. I'm going to emphasize this half step on the next string down. Well, that would be here. So we're going to say there's the D right there. So that means that if I'm going to do the same pattern, but I want to go the second, go from the first up here to the second, and then I'll play the scale up from there. We're going to say that the second's going to be 2 notes away. It's always just going to be 2 notes away from wherever I was at. So I know there's 5 notes between each string, so it's going to be 5, 10, and then 15. There's only 12 notes in the musical alphabet. 15 minus 12 is going to be 3, and then back here gives me 2. So I can see where that is. So that's a 2 note away. We can call it a major second, right? It's a major second away from this note, using that as my focal point. So I can say, if I count it from here, 5, 10, 15. 15 minus 12 is going to be 3, 2. So that from here to here would be the second note in my scale, right? That would be my second note, and then I could go up from here. So that's going to go to the 3, it's a whole step. 3 to 4 is going to be a half step. 4 to 5 is going to be a whole step. That starts over. The 5's right there. 5 to 6 is a whole step. 6 to 7 is a whole step. And then 7 to 8 or back to 1 is going to be a half step. And there's my octave. So if I played this way, then I'm going to say this is going to be 1 to 2 is a whole step. 1 to 2 is a whole step. 2 to 3 is a whole step. 3 to 4 is a half step. 4 to 5 is a whole step. That whole step is over here as well with the open D, and then we go whole step, and then whole step, and then half step back home. 7 to 8. So there's the C, and then there's the C. Okay, let's try another one. I'm getting a little tired here, but this is new exercise. But I'm gonna keep going here. All right, let's say 2 more strings. So let's say we go to the next one. The D is going to be here, right? So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 frets back. So now I'm looking for the second on 4 strings down. So if I count that out, then it's going to be, I'm looking for a 2 note away major second, and then I'll play the same pattern from there. It's going to be 5, 10, 15. 15 minus 12 is going to be negative 3, or just 3 plus another 5 is 8. 7, 6, 5, 4, 3. Wait a sec. 5, 10, 15, and then here's the fault line. Now this shifts up this way. So 15 minus 12 is 3. And then to get another 5, I have to shift this way to get to 8 because this fault line shifts up 8 and then 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Let's count it. And then once I get there, there's the 2, 2 to the 3, 3 to the 4 is a half step, 4 to 5 is a whole step, 5 to 6 is a whole step, 6 to 7 is a whole step. That repeats over here, and then 7 to 8 is going to be a half step. So let's count it out this way. So if I was here, it's going to be 5, 10, and then from here it goes 5, 10, and then 15. 15 minus 12 is 3. 3 plus another 5. This fault line shifts this way. So we're going to say there's going to be 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. Right, there we are. Way back here. Okay, that makes sense. So we're on from this C to that D would be a 2 note away, which would be a major second. So we're going to say, okay, I go from, if I want to play the scale out and focus on this difference of the 2, I go from the 1 to the 2, it's a whole step. 2 to 3 is a whole step. 3 to 4 is a half step. 4 to 5 is a whole step. 5 to 6 is a whole step. 6 to 7 is a whole step. And that B is here, that repeats over here. Open B, 7 to 8 is a half step. Then here's my C, and that's the same, that's an octave of that C. So here's the C, and that's a C. And then of course it repeats. If I go down here, we'd have the same pattern because we have the same C on the bottom and on the top. Okay, so I'm gonna keep repeating that pattern. I'm going to kind of drill it into my mind in following presentations. Next time we'll focus more on the second, right? So I'm going to then go from the 1, and then we're going to go to the 2, and then when I go to the 3, that's when I'm going to, or maybe I'll go to the 2 within the pattern here. And then when I go to the 3, I'm going to check it on each of the other strings, basically. And we'll just keep on kind of walking through the pattern that way. And then I'd also like to possibly do it going backwards. And as we're doing this, I want to basically try to be emphasizing the different modes that we're looking at, try to work that into the presentation, as well as where each of those modes kind of live. So that, and the idea would be then we can start from any spot. I can play up and down the guitar by using the formula. And by using the formula, all I need to know then is where is a major second and a minor second from each of the spots, each note on each string. I just need to know those 2 intervals, and then I can always skip to any other string, right? Because that's the beauty of it. Whereas if I'm working from C, I have to know all of the intervals, right? But if I'm just walking up the scale and I want to switch things up by skipping a string, for example, going an octave higher or whatever, then all I need to know is the intervals going from string to string for the major second and minor second, because those are the only 2 intervals you're going to have when you're going up the scale. And then when you're going down the scale, you're going to have to learn, we need to learn the whole step and half step backwards, which are basically the inverse intervals. And so maybe we'll get into that more in future presentations, and hopefully I'll get a little bit more succinct in putting that exercise together to make it more tight. So we'll work on it.